Hello everybody, my name is Kat and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things horror. And today I'm giving my review of Longlegs, the newest film by director Osgood Perkins. This was one of my most anticipated films of this year, just looking at the marketing material. I remember when those first posters and trailers came out quite a few months ago, and they were just so eerie and creepy. And right from the get-go, I just loved the visuals that Perkins was giving us. So I was really excited to see what he was going to actually do with this film, especially since, you have the great Nicolas Cage in it playing the main serial killer. And yeah, from all of the marketing materials, it was just giving very modern day Silence of the Lambs type vibes. So I was really looking forward to this film a lot. Again, this was one of my most anticipated movies of 2024. Did the film live up to expectations? Well, we'll get into that. This will be a spoiler review. I am going to talk about spoilers later on. I'll give my initial thoughts first before I start getting into the spoilers. But much like another recent film, Maxine, it's kind of hard to talk about this film without talking about the third act specifically. There seems to be this pattern happening where you're having these films coming out and they're really great for the first two acts. And then, I don't know, something just happens in that third act and it's I call it the third act fizzle, right? The narrative just kind of starts to unravel a bit. So we'll get into that in more detail later on in the review. This is a film where if you haven't seen it yet, and I would probably recommend people go see this movie. There's enough creepiness here that I think most people, especially if you're someone that maybe you like horror films but you don't watch them religiously, there's definitely enough here where I could see audiences really liking this movie. If you're more of a horror junkie like me and you watch horror films all the time, there's nothing really here that's reinventing the wheel. This isn't really presenting you with anything that you haven't seen before. Either way, I would say temper your expectations going into it, right? If you're going into this hoping that it is going to be this ultra scary, ultra gruesome, violent, gory horror film, you're going to be disappointed. If you're going into it thinking it's going to be more of psychological thriller on the level of something like Silence of the Lambs or Seven, you're also going to be disappointed. It's a film that exists in this weird kind of in-between space. It's not really one or the other. It's definitely borrowing aspects from both horror and psychological crime thriller. And I will be honest as well, when I went into this film, I was expecting something like Silence of the Lambs or Seven.
And the trick just was sort of well, what if you pretended to be remaking Silence of the Lambs? Well, it was actually this whole other card trick the whole time.
I was kind of hoping that, yeah, we were gonna get a kind of modern day version of that because we haven't had a film like that in a while. So admittedly, I was also coming into this movie having expectations of it being something that it's not, and I think that did add to the slight disappointment that I felt when leaving the film. That being said, I do think one of the biggest problems with this film is in the thematics. I feel like I come on here every week talking about these horror movies and I say the same things over and over again. It is not my intention to come on here and keep shitting on these movies. I don't want to do this. I want these films to be great, but we keep having this consistent problem where there's just not clear thematic through lines throughout these narratives. There's not clear motivations of the characters. There's not clear intentions as to why things are happening. And that's what I felt this movie suffered with the most. I felt the narrative was really muddled. There are things in this film that will get set up in the beginning or in the second act, and you're thinking okay, this is going to play a role somehow in this grander narrative, and then it doesn't. These things get forgotten about by the end of the film. And sure, you can question well, what does it really matter? Who cares? But I promise you, these are the things that distinguish a really great film from just a kind of mediocre one, which again is so frustrating for me because I think this film does offer something that has been severely missing in modern horror cinema, at least the films that have been coming out this year, and that is that this film has atmosphere. Perkins is creating such a great atmosphere here. I mean, this world is bleak. It is dreadful. Every single scene you're going into it and you're just kind of dreading what is gonna happen. I remember just sitting there and thinking I'm so glad I don't live in this world with these characters because man, this is so bleak and so depressing. It's something that I've been craving for in modern horror films, and please just give me atmosphere, give me cinematography, give me me just like these really great expansive visuals where I don't know what is going to come out of the corner at any given moment, and that's what's going to be the most terrifying part of this film. Longlegs has that. Longlegs has great atmosphere. I loved the visuals in this film. There are so many moments in here that are so creepy and so unsettling. I mean, some of the most like disturbing imagery that I think I've seen in a horror film this year. The way that some of the shots are set up in this movie are great, right? He's setting up this world where anything could happen, anything could come at you like within the frame, right? So he's framing this in a very like specific way, in a way that's very intentional. And there are several shots where it's like you'll have characters that are like right in the foreground of the frame, and then there's like all this space behind them in the background, right? And as the viewer, you're just sitting there like constantly like checking like the space behind the character, right? Like you want to look at the character and see like what they're doing and what they're finding, but like there's just this like suspense that at any moment something's going to be peeking around the corner or something's going to be creeping up on our character. Like he's building dread and suspense so well in this movie with the way that he's placing the camera. And there are certainly several moments within this movie where it's like you'll see something creepy happening in the background and it's just like, ugh, like what is that? There's definitely a lot of imagery that will stick with you. What I also liked about this movie is that there's almost a sense of like timelessness to it, in the sense that like you're not really sure what time period it's taking place in. And I'm saying that, but that's not really true. Like it's technically supposed to take place in the 90s, I believe. And the way that you know that is because in the FBI offices, there's just this like giant portrait of Bill Clinton that for some reason Osgood Perkins shows us many times throughout the film. So it is supposed to be a film that's like set in the 90s. However, you know, it does feel like timeless. Like it doesn't really feel like you know kind of which decade you're supposed to take place in. It almost kind of has a similar feeling to something like It Follows, where on the one hand It Follows has very like retro vibe, but then there's also like all this like weird kind of technology in the film, and so you're not really like sure what time period you're supposed to be placed in. It kind of has that vibe to it, and I wish Longlegs had kind of gone more into that vibe, because I think that also adds to like the creepiness and just kind of the unsettling feeling that this film gives you. Like lacking a sense of like time can be really disorienting. And I think that plays well to a film like this, which is very much just trying to disorient you throughout the whole entire runtime. I think the acting in this film is great too. I really liked Mika Monroe as our protagonist. I thought she had a really great presence on screen. I also really enjoyed Blair Underwood as Agent Carter. I thought his relationship with Mika's character was really well done. And then of course, the great Nicolas Cage. Nicolas Cage gives a very creepy performance in this movie as Longlegs. He is very unsettling to watch. He has like weird makeup and like prosthetics going on. There was something about the prosthetics, like they were very exaggerated, and part of me was wondering, like, was that his character like creating these kind of prosthetics and sticking them on his face? Like you learn that he's pretty much a craftsman of sorts. So I was like, I don't know, maybe he is just like creating these like weird like prosthetics to like stick on his face. His intro to the film was like my favorite part of this movie. My favorite scene of this movie. It was so well done. It was so creepy. Where you just have this little girl and she sees this truck pulling up outside her house and she goes outside. And again, the framing is so well done where it's like you're just seeing these like wide shots of her backyard and it's like snowing and so everything is like white. And then she turns and the camera follows her and then it's like bam, there's like Nicolas Cage being creepy. And what I also loved about the first part of this film is that they don't show his face completely. The way that they frame him, like you're only kind of seeing like this much of him. And then when they do show his face, it's like a very like brief second and then they immediately cut to the credits. And I was really hoping as the film was going on that they were going to keep that method, right? I was like, yeah, just kind of keep him in the shadows or keep him just kind of slightly out of the frame. Again, it goes back to that feeling of unsettlingness. Unsettlingness? Is that a word? Just making the audience feel unsettled, right? And one of the ways that you can do that very easily is by not giving away like certain things. It goes back to that unknown factor, right? And that is something that horror is all about, right? Horror is at its best when it's just kind of playing with the unknown. I wasn't like the biggest fan of where they end up taking his character. And the more that the story goes on, the more that they like reveal about him, which he's still pretty creepy throughout the whole thing, but I did like it more when they kind of kept him a little bit like concealed and we didn't really see the whole thing. So yeah, I thought Nick Cage was great. As with every film, I'm always like, we just needed more Nicolas Cage. Actually, for this film, I would say probably not. I think if we had gotten more Nicolas Cage, it probably would have been overkill. At this point, I am going to get into spoilers and start talking about the third act. So if you have not seen the film yet, click off, come back when you have seen it. So yeah, for me, the third act is where the film started to fall apart a little bit. It felt very rushed. you know, the big revelation that our character has. Like, it just felt very anticlimactic compared to the rest of the movie. So let's start with Nicolas Cage's character, because I think that was like probably one of the first moments where I was kind of feeling like, okay, there goes the narrative a little bit. So they end up discovering that Nicolas Cage is Longlegs, and the FBI is able to find him and pick him up pretty easily. And you have this kind of back and forth between Monroe's character and Nicolas Cage. He's kind of going on this whole thing of like, oh, I worship the devil, I'm doing this for Satan. Like, right, you very much learn that his character is a Satanist. There's a lot of religious stuff going on in here, and he goes around and like finds these families. He finds these victims as a sacrifice, I believe, for the devil. She's interrogating him, and he's like telling her like, oh, maybe you should like ask your mother what's going on, right? She has a weird relationship with her mom. They do set that up at the beginning of the film. And then he like takes himself out by bashing his head on the table. Was giving very like Hereditary vibes, but he just like kills himself there in the interrogation room. And then it's like, oh, okay, that's it. Well, that was kind of easy. I mean, this is also where it starts going from like a traditional psychological thriller into a more like supernatural film. And again, you know, I was going into this with my like Silence of the Lambs brain on. So I was going into it thinking of like, you know, that great like final scene at the end of that movie where you have like Clarice and Buffalo Bill just kind of like chasing each other. So I was kind of hoping for something like that. And then, yeah, we didn't get that. Longlegs just like removes himself from the narrative. And then you find out is that, yes, Nicolas Cage is worshiping the devil, and the devil, I think, tells him like which sacrifices he wants, right? So it seems like the devil is really after like little girls, like girls who are turning like 9 or 10 years old. And there's a thing where, you know, they all share the same birthday. It's always like the 14th of whatever, you know, given month. What you find out is happening is that essentially Longlegs is not actually killing these people. It's something that is possessing the patriarchs of the family, right? The fathers, who then go around and kill their daughters and their wives and then kill themselves. Monroe's character, Lee, I think her name is, Lee, her mother, is actually working in partnership with Longlegs. And this is something that they set up at the beginning of the film very early on, that like it seems like Longlegs has some sort of accomplice. So you find out that it is Lee's mother this whole time, and that explains why she was always acting like weird and why they have a strained relationship.
Do you still say your prayers?
And again, it's a whole kind of convoluted thing where you find out that that first scene of the film that I loved a lot, that little girl was actually Lee, and Longlegs was going to kill her, but then her mom was able to save her and create a deal with the devil where she would help Longlegs to kill off these victims. And she does that by dressing up like a nun and going to these family homes and saying like, hey, I'm a member of the church and you won this prize. And the prize is these like giant dolls that Longlegs builds. And these dolls are replicas of whatever like little girl they're going to be sacrificing. And the dolls are also possessed by the spirits of Satan. And it's the spirit of Satan that is then possessing the dads to then kill his family. Okay. I think I got all that right. My biggest problem with this explanation, pretty much the way that I just explained it to you, is how they explain it in the movie. I mean, they do take a more like kind of whimsical approach where it's like you have the mom who's being like, oh, once upon a time there was a little girl, right? And then she just kind of explains everything that I just told you. So we have this huge like exposition dump in the third act. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you know how I feel about these exposition dumps in movies. It just comes across as like so lazy. It comes across as like, you know, the filmmaker somewhere along the lines just got like lost, right? And it's just kind of like an easy way out of things. Let's stop the movie so I can explain everything to you audience, and then we can just like wrap this up and go home. It's like, well, it's not a very like satisfying narrative experience. And yes, they still do have like strong visuals through all of this that are helping. Satan will like pop up every now and again. I will say like the shots of the demon are pretty effective, right? There's pretty creepy. There's specifically like one image of the evil entity, right, where they're just kind of like shrouded in like this black like cloth, and you just like see their eyes, and that's very unsettling. That's actually a really cool image. Like I feel like you could have just given me that that. I don't know if you needed to give me a whole explanation as to everything. I think this is also a film where I think it would have served better if it had left some stuff up to interpretation. Because the explanation that it gives, when you start thinking about it within the context of the whole film, this is where like things start to fall apart. And it's also a problem because it's like they spend so much time explaining like certain things about this mythology, but then other things are not explained at all. And so then it's like, well, what was the point of all of that? For example, one of the discoveries the FBI agents make, and I think the second act, is they find one of these dolls that Longlegs has created that the devil possesses. This is the doll of their first like official victim. They bring it back to their FBI headquarters. They have forensics look it over, and the forensics guy is like, oh yeah, I found this like metal orb in the head of the doll, like where the brain was supposed to be. So they take it out and they're like, oh, like what is that? And like, you know, it's making weird noises, but there's like nothing inside of it. And I guess it's a thing of like that orb kept the real life victim in a catatonic state, because what you find out is that she did survive, but she's in a mental hospital. But then they take the orb out of the doll and then suddenly she's like animated again and she's acting like a normal human being again. So it seemed like the orb had like something to do with like controlling her and her mind, but like I don't really know because that never comes back up. So that's why I'm saying, like, it feels like certain things get like set up and it seems like they're gonna play some sort of role later on in the film, and then they just don't. It's just kind of like completely like forgotten about. I've said this before in other reviews, but when you're making a film, you only have so much time to tell a story. And so it's like, if you're gonna spend time focusing on something, you want to be able to have some sort of payoff for that at the end. Like, that's what creates like a satisfying narrative. Like, those are those moments where it's like we as the audience, we get to the third act and then we're like, oh, okay, that's what was going on, right? Like, that's what's satisfying about watching these kinds of movies, is when it like all finally comes together. And then yeah, as I was saying at the beginning of the review, like, it doesn't seem like there's a really big like thematic through line here. Again, I know I say this in every review, I feel like, but what was this film trying to say? You know, if you were to think of like the films that this one is being compared to, right? It's being touted by these film critics as like the next Silence of the Lambs or the next Seven. If you look at Silence of the Lambs or Seven, like, there are very clear thematics at play here, right? Whether it's Seven and this whole idea of corruption and violence and just kind of a loss of morals in society. And the film is definitely posing a question to you as the audience of like, how do you respond to that? Do you just respond in apathy, like what we see with Morgan Freeman's character? Are you someone that kind of goes the other extreme, like with Kevin Spacey's character, right? The serial killer in that film? Or is there room for still keeping some sense of like hope? So you have a very like clear theme, and you have like very clear questions that the film is posing to you as an audience. Or you have something like Silence of the Lambs, which is very much steeped in ideas around identity, having an identity crisis and themes around like sexuality. And you have a whole narrative thread in that film around like Clarice and being a female in this very male-driven world, and kind of like the dangers that poses, right? And they kind of try to do that in Longlegs as well. Like, they tiptoe around that. Like, there's one scene with Monroe's character where she's meeting with the young daughter of Agent Carter, and the daughter asks her like, oh, is it scary being a woman FBI agent or something like that? And she's like, yeah, it is. But then like, they don't really do much with that beyond that line, which I guess is fine, but it does feel like they're trying to do something around like, I don't know, being a woman in this world, right? The whole thing of like the devil specifically going after like little girls. There's also something here around like transitioning between like a child to an adult. Because when the girls are killed, it's again around these like pivotal kind of birthday times, right? Where it's like you're going to be making the transition from like a child into a teenager. There's something with like her mom says, I had to sacrifice myself so you would be allowed to grow up, so you would be allowed to kind of become an adult. So there seems to be like something there, but I'm not quite sure what that is. Maybe something about how evil just like permeates everywhere and it like corrupts our innocence. I don't know. I'm spitballing here. I also feel like we were really lacking in like character motivations. Like, again, if you think back of like Seven and Silence of the Lambs, when you think of the antagonists, whether it's John Doe or Buffalo Bill, these are characters that have clear motivations, right? You understand like why they're doing the things that they're doing. Here with Longlegs and Nicolas Cage, like, I don't really know why he's so like into the devil worship. What is it about like Satan and Satanism that drew him into it? Because it doesn't seem like he's supposed to be a physical manifestation of Satan on earth. It seems like he is just kind of like a minion. If you have like a clear motive then that helps to clarify what the overall theme of the film is. Same thing with like Monroe's character. Like they do set up that she has this slightly like religious background, like with her mom always asking her like, oh, are you like reading the Bible? I'm not really sure like how she feels about like religion, or like how does she actually feel about all this like supernatural stuff, and how does that connect to what she went through as a child? Because we have scenes where it's like she's trying to decipher Nicolas Cage's like weird writing, and she's like grabs a Bible and is then just like easily able to like decipher it from there. And it's like, well, did you know that because you were forced to read the Bible as a kid, and now that you have to go back to the Bible to kind of find these answers, like how are you feeling about it? Like, I don't know, I feel like there was so many more opportunities for them to like go deeper with these characters. Also, they set it up that Monroe's character is like sort of psychic at the beginning of the film. Like they kind of make a whole big deal of that at the beginning of the film, and then that aspect of her character is completely forgotten about by the third act. And so it's like, well, what was the point of that? She's only psychic when the narrative needs her to be. She's only psychic when the narrative needs her to help move the plot along. Otherwise, like, it's just not there. It's completely forgotten about. It's frustrating because it's like, if you had maybe brought in someone to kind of help you figure out the story a little bit more and make a little bit more clear connections between all these things that you're bringing up, you could have had a really fantastic film. Like, this is one of the few films where I would say I almost wanted it to be a little bit longer. I almost wanted it to have like maybe 20 or 34 minutes just to kind of flesh out these elements a little bit more. So yeah, overall I have just very conflicted feelings about this movie because I loved the visuals. It had the atmosphere that I've been craving, right? I loved a lot of the like old-time footage, right, when we're getting the scenes where they're supposed to be like flashbacks, but I think they're so well done, and I think some of the strongest, like creepiest visuals are in these moments. And after the film, I was like, you know, I could have almost taken the film as a more like experimental type project, right, where you're just kind of having like this really weird, grainy imagery and you're kind of telling the story that way. At this point, like, all I'm really craving in the horror genre is like, I just want a really simple film, like a Halloween movie, but just something that has like a really simple plot that's not too convoluted, but something that's also able to create like just a very creepy atmosphere. Something simple with good atmosphere and good plot. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Longlegs. You know, I will say I'm filming this the morning after I saw the film, so I have not had a lot of time to digest it, so there might be some things that get more clearer as I sit with the film a bit more and think about it a bit more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Did you like this movie? Did it live up to the hype for you? Let me know your thoughts, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching.